Okay, I want to finish up just a couple of extraneous things concerning the apologists, looking at the early church, a couple different issues, and then we're going to move on in your notes. This is not in your notes. Just for your information concerning baptism, there's a lot of controversy between different groups of people concerning baptism. It would appear that in the 1st through the 3rd century, that baptism was reserved for believers. And that it's from during the 3rd century that we have our earliest reference to infant baptism. And you can read some of the statements that are there. First time it's ever commanded is in 350. The Lord's Supper, up through the 2nd century, it was a sacrifice of praise and thanksgiving, so it was looked at as being a chance to celebrate what Jesus did, to remember what he did. And then in the 3rd century, it becomes a sacrifice that is both sacrificial and praise, but non-meritorious. In other words, they began to see the Lord's Supper as being a sacrifice itself. In other words, if there's something being done, like here, we offer up to Christ who is sacrificed for our sins. So they begin to look at the bread and the cup as being a sacrifice itself, the offering of Christ again, which is going to become more and more problematic as time goes on. Let's get that. Okay, why were the apologists necessary? Next in your notes, looking at the political threat from the state as being the first reason why apologists were necessary. And initially there were local, first of all, did I miss something? Oh, there it is. I skipped ahead. First of all, there were local persecutions from the time of Christ's resurrection up to 249, so that we find in the area of Jerusalem, Judea, different areas within the Roman Empire, but particularly around Jerusalem, that there were local persecutions, initially brought by the Jewish leadership. So you had Stephen being stoned to death, you have James being killed by Herod Agrippa, Peter and Paul were both executed by Emperor Nero. You have then Ignatius, Aristides, Polycarp, Justin Martyr, Athenagoras, Origen's father, Irenaeus, Perpetua, who did you read about Perpetua? Perpetua was a young lady who was put into the arena with wild animals. Felicitas, same kind of deal. These were young ladies that were willing to give their lives for Christ. So, but these were all local. Even if it took place in Rome, it still was somewhat of a local persecution that wasn't worldwide. Then in 249 to 251, just for a couple of years, we have a worldwide persecution. The cause was that in AD 247, Rome turned 1,000 years old. And there were celebrations throughout the city for 3 days and nights. Most Christians refused to take part in the festivities because they were centered around worshiping pagan deities. Many wondered if the Christians then had angered the gods because they wouldn't participate. So Emperor Decius reasoned that the reason that there were bad things happening in the empire is because the Christians had angered the gods. And so he launched an empire-wide persecution. The reasons that he used for singling out Christians were that Christians had turned from the state to the church. So they had turned away from the Roman government to the church in their allegiance. Secondly, Christians had turned down public office. Christians refused to serve the public by having an office. And thirdly, Christians were not joining the army. So what these things all wrapped up to be is that they were not patriotic or anti-patriotic. And so Decius decided to try to rid the empire of this negative effect of Christians. So the aim of Decius was to achieve universal support for Rome, so that everybody would be behind Rome. Everybody would be serving Rome, that there would not be people that were going a different direction. And to accomplish that, he felt that he needed to make Christians sacrifice to the idols of Rome. That would take care of their allegiance to Christ. If we make them sacrifice to idols, then they no longer would be serving Christ. The progress of it, and here we see in the whole scheme of the Roman emperors. Remember, we had we have Tiberius, Claudius, Nero, and that's where the fall of Jerusalem takes place. Nero persecuted Christians, but more on a local level. Vespasian, Titus, Trajan, Hadrian, Antonius Pius, Marcus Aurelius, Septimus Severus, and now we come down to Decius. So it's all the way down here that Decius sets up a worldwide persecution of the church. And then we have these two guys, Valerian coming, and then Diocletian will come later. He also will persecute the church. So these are the two greatest persecutors, Decius and Diocletian. The progress of getting Christians to sacrifice to idols was this. They required everyone to have a certificate of sacrifice. So every person in the empire was required to be able to produce, when asked, a certificate of sacrifice, indicating that you had given a sacrifice to the gods. And if you didn't, you would be imprisoned and possibly tortured. And this is a picture of a certificate of sacrifice that has been found. I'm sure you can't read it. It's pretty tattered. But what it says is this. At the top it says certificates, sacrifice certificate to the sacrifice commission from Diogenes, age 72 years, with a scar over my right eyebrow. Okay, why is that included on there? Why do you think it includes not only his name, his age, but he's got a scar over his right eyebrow? What do you think, Zach?
So nobody could like picture him?
Yeah, because they didn't have pictures. Today you pull out your driver's license, there's a picture of you, and the policeman can look at it and say, okay, that is you, but no pictures. So there's at least a description so nobody else can use that certificate. And then it says this: I've always sacrificed to the gods. Now, in obedience to the emperor, I've sacrificed again, poured out a drink offering, and eaten meat offered to the gods. Please certify this below. And then it says, I, Cyrus, saw Diogenes and his son sacrificing. So Cyrus must have been an official, and he signed it. This guy really did sacrifice. All right, so that was what was being required. So if you're a Christian at that time, what do you do? I'll come back to that. Initially, this program was very successful. For example, even the Bishop of Smyrna sacrificed. So there were Christians that were willing to do that in order not to be imprisoned or tortured. However, many prominent overseers died from injuries that they suffered in prison, including Origen. During times of persecution in Rome, Christians often met in the catacombs, a series of tunnels beneath Rome. They met there, but they weren't really hiding from their persecutors as much as they were gathering there to remember the deceased Christians who were buried there. So these were burial areas down in these tunnels. And sometimes people say, well, the Christians were hiding in the catacombs. They weren't really hiding. That's just where they met in order to commemorate those that had been killed. Here is an example, a picture of in the catacombs. You can see the skulls lining up there. Now, Decius died in June 251 in a campaign against the Goths. So his persecution only lasted a couple of years. But that brought about a controversy in the church called the Novatian controversy. It was a debate on what was to be done with believers who sacrificed to idols and wanted back in the church. You understand the problem? You know, let's say you guys form a local church, and Jesus has said you've got to offer sacrifices, you've got to have a certificate. And let's say Stephen and Noah give in and they offer a sacrifice, they've got a certificate. All right, now the persecution's over, and Stephen and Noah say, we want to come back in the church. What do? You say, wait a minute. You guys offered sacrifices to pagan gods. You denied Christ. And meanwhile, Amelia refused to do it, and she was put in prison and died there. So what do you guys think? You going to let them back into church or not?
No.
But they say they're sorry. But poor Amelia died. Yeah, did you see the problem? And that's the issue that comes up here. So a guy by the name of Novatus believed that they should not be readmitted because, why? Anyone who tried to avoid martyrdom was a false believer. So he's saying, you guys weren't true believers if you did that. So you're not part of the church, you're not a true believer. So he came up with what he determined were mortal sins for which there is no forgiveness. A mortal sin, mortal means death, right? These are deadly sins for which there's no forgiveness. The first one he said was apostasy. And that relates exactly to what was going on here. Do you know the word apostasy? Anybody know that word? Apostasy means to leave the faith. To say you have believed, but then you depart from that. So if you offered sacrifices to idols, you'd be guilty of apostasy. You have denied the faith that you said you believed. And notice says, if you do that, you can't be forgiven for that. No forgiveness. The second sin that he said was a mortal sin was adultery. So if you commit adultery, you're no longer in the church. You cannot be forgiven for that. The third one was murder. If you commit a murder, you can't be forgiven. All right, so what do you think? What are the pros and cons of having these three mortal sins as being determinative whether you can be forgiven or not? What do you think, John?
All sins are the same.
What do you mean all sins are the same?
I mean, God weighs them all the same. You murder someone the same as the law.
Okay, so what you're saying is God doesn't have sins that are unforgivable and sins that are forgivable. Every sin is forgivable. What would you say to that? Well, you apostatizers, do you agree with that? How about the rest of you? Would you agree with John or not? So you just let them back in then? Yeah, you guys all said before you don't want to let them back in, didn't you? Isn't that what you said before? Okay. Are you going back on that now? Griff says no.
No.
So they can't be forgiven?
No.
So you disagree with John then?
Yeah.
All right, so there are some sins that are unforgivable. And you would say these three are unforgivable? Can any of you think of anyone in the Bible that committed any of these three sins and were forgiven?
David. Wait.
You're the one that's in agreement here. You're coming up with reasons to not be in agreement. David was guilty of what?
Adultery.
Adultery and murder. Right? Did God forgive him?
Yeah.
Yeah?
Okay.
Okay, anybody else you can think of? Paul was guilty of what? Murder. He was killing Christians. Was he forgiven? Yeah. Anybody else you can think of? John?
Could Solomon kind of be this because he had many wives?
Adultery? Yeah. Solomon had a lot of wives. I'm not sure if that would technically be adultery, but it certainly was not a good thing.
Would like Jonah maybe for apostasy?
Running away from God?
Yeah.
I'm not sure that would go to the level of apostasy because he wasn't denying God. He just didn't want to do what God wanted to do. He was just being disobedient. John?
Peter,
What?
apostasy because he denied Jesus.
Yeah. Peter denied that he even knew Jesus 3 times, with oath sometimes. Was he forgiven? Yeah. So, I guess if you guys really are sorry for what you did, you can let them back in. You're still not so sure. You're the one that gave us examples, but you're still not sure. Well, a guy by the name of Cyprian believed that if they showed outward signs of sorrow and prayer and fasting, that they could be readmitted. If you had a now his caveat was not that you actually offered a sacrifice, because there were some Christians who got fake certificates. So even Cyprian didn't think that if you had a real certificate you should be admitted, but he said if you had a fake certificate and expressed sorrow that you could get back in. Now, here's his reasoning. See if you follow this. He said that without the church as your mother, you couldn't have God as your father. So in other words, if you were excluded from the church, you couldn't be saved. God couldn't be your father if you don't have the church as your mother, if you're not in the church. Okay, that's just the way he put it, which is an interesting way to say this, and this is going to have an influence on things in later times. All right, so you understand the Novatian controversy. Novatus says there are 3 sins that are unforgivable. Cyprian says, look, if they show real sorrow for what they did, they can be readmitted to the church. And I'm not sure anybody was talking about the issues that we did, that there are many people in the Bible that were guilty of these things, and yet were forgiven. Okay, so we have, again, Dionysius' persecution lasts a couple of years, and then we have some local persecutions that go on again under Emperor Valerian, who's here. In 257, several bishops were deported. Christian places and cemeteries were closed. In 258, Valerian ordered the execution of bishops, priests, and deacons. He confiscated church property. He took away privileges from any that were in society, and reduced his imperial civil servants to slavery. One of those who lost his head at this time was Cyprian, the guy who had argued against Novatus before, who argued for grace toward people who had fake certificates. His head was cut off. Then we come to, he's not listed on here, Claudius II. In addition to persecuting Christians for their failure to sacrifice to the gods, Claudius II outlawed marriage. His thinking was that marriage and family were preventing soldiers from being effective. So he was having trouble recruiting soldiers. And he got to thinking, what is it that's keeping soldiers from joining the army? I know. It's because they're getting married and having families. So what's the solution? Outlaw marriage and families. Then you get more guys joining up as soldiers. In a convoluted way, it almost makes sense, but you can't imagine that that really works. But it was against the law to get married. Well, it's at this time that an overseer of the city of Tournai, named Valentinus, or Valentine, was engaging in marrying couples who wanted to be married. And some think he also helped some Christians to escape from prison. But apparently the predominant thing is that he was performing wedding ceremonies. And so he was imprisoned. He was imprisoned for some time. And while he was in the prison, the jailer's daughter, who was blind, was the one who brought food to the prisoners. And Valentine got to know the jailer's daughter very well, became friendly, and Valentine led her to know the Lord. And then he prayed for her that God would restore her sight, and he did. Well, that was a great witness to the jailer, and the jailer came to know the Lord as well. Well, then came the appointed time for Valentine to be taken out and to be executed. Before he left his cell, he wrote a letter to the jailer's daughter, encouraging her in the faith, encouraging her to keep following Christ. And he signed it, "Love, your Valentine." And that's where we get Valentine's Day, as he was executed on February 14th in the year 269. All right, so the first Valentine was not a love letter and romantic love. It was a love letter of a man to encourage a younger Christian. Now you know the rest of the story. Any comments, questions? All right, then we go back to worldwide persecutions again under Diocletian. So there's been persecution all the way through here, but it's been localized in this time period. But then we get to Diocletian, and he's going to bring about a empire-wide persecution. He felt that the only way to save the empire was uniformity. That is, if everybody believes the same. If the empire was united politically by the emperors and culturally by Roman culture, then it should only have one religion. Good old Roman paganism. That's the religion for us, Diocletian said. Therefore, Christians were persecuted because they wouldn't abide by that perspective. So Christians were thrown out of the army and out of government service. I think that this was the time, I know I read a story, I'm not sure when it happened, I think it was during this time period where there was a group of Christian soldiers who had been formerly wrestlers, and they had wrestled for the emperor, and they had a song that they sang, indicating we are wrestling for the emperor. Well, then their unit was shipped off to Northern Europe. They were up there, stationed up there, when their commander got word that all Christians were to either submit to pagan gods or to be killed. And the commander knew these guys were really good soldiers, and so he wanted to give them a chance. And so it was wintertime, and he put them out on a frozen lake after having stripped them of all their clothing. They were out there, and he said, anytime you want to come in, you can come into the fire if you renounce Christ. And there were 40 of them out there on this lake. And as they were out there, they began singing together. Only instead of singing 40 wrestlers for the emperor, they sang 40 wrestlers for Christ. And they kept singing this. And after a while, their voices became less and less loud and began to fade as they were dying out there in that frozen lake. Finally, as the commander was standing there, he saw a lone figure crawling across the ice under the shore. And he crawled up to the fire to warm himself. That broke that commander as he realized that these men were giving their lives for Christ. And he decided that he would give himself to Christ as well. And so he stripped himself of his armor, of his clothing, and he walked out into the center of the lake with those other Christians and died there with them. Some amazing things like that happened during these times of persecution, and during the time of Diocletian, there is a lot of persecution of Christians being thrown out of the army, government service. Secondly, churches and scriptures were destroyed. He especially was going after the scriptures. He wanted to destroy every copy of the scriptures. And so they were searching for any copies of God's word. And he thought he had destroyed them all. In fact, he erected a monument to himself. You know, back in the ancient times and Roman times, if you had a great victory, you would erect a column, and on the column you would detail your victory over a certain enemy. Well, he erected a column, and on it he said that he had defeated Christianity. He defeated the Christians. They were gone because he thought he had wiped them all out. Well, we'll see whether that was true or not in a little bit. One of the things he decided to do in order to solidify the empire was really divide it. By dividing it, he thought he would make it stronger. And so he put a man by the name of Constantius in charge of the Western Empire, over here, put Maximian in charge of the central area in Rome, and Galerius was in charge of the Eastern Empire, all under him, Diocletian. And it's actually from Galerius that the major thrust of persecution against Christians came. He gained influence after a decisive victory over the Persians, and so had a lot of influence on Diocletian. We'll come back to that later. Next, I want us to look at threats from within Christianity. So that was threats from without. There were political threats from outside, of emperors trying to destroy Christianity. But there are also problems within the church, and we want to look at some of that. I think we will skip over Manichaeanism. I have that in there. It is similar to some other philosophies, and I just don't want to burn you down with a lot of different ideas. Try to keep to the ones that maybe are the main ones that still have an influence today. So let's go to Gnosticism. Is that next in your notes then? You see Gnosticism? Theological threat from within. What is Gnosticism? Gnosticism is an attempt to answer basic philosophical questions. And now that I think about it, I see the time we have left, I think rather than start this partway through, we will begin looking at Gnosticism tomorrow. So in the time we have left, I'll let you get started, if you haven't already, the articles that I have assigned for you for tomorrow. So the articles looking at the different apologists. So read and highlight those. We'll talk a little bit about what you read there. You're gonna find some things that I haven't told you that you might find interesting, and maybe some of the things are the same as I've told you. It'll just kind of reinforce what we already know about these guys. You have a question, John? Okay, so let's do some reading.